Welcome to 962 of the Heidegger series, and we continue at chapter 10, modifying duration 2, and it starts very literally. When the young protagonist in the rock opera Tommy develops into pinball wizard, more entrainment occurs. He stands like a statue, becomes part of the machine. Feeling of the bumpers, always playing clean, plays by intuition. The digit counters fall. That deaf and dumb and blind kid sure plays a mean pinball. The young man in question has not simply looked into the rhythm of the machine, but has experienced a boundary shift too. While looking into another person's stride or breathing rhythm can significantly change one's own well-being. Reducing or extending one's boundary is yet more profound change. As we saw in chapter 4, reduced or extended observer participants have recalibrated their body map and truly severed an internal or incorporated an external object or rhythm. Although many observer participant extensions remain elusive, as in the case with Tommy becoming a part of the machine, others can be pinned on by external observers. Extensions can be made transparent if our internal range of possible responses to environmental changes allow us, for instance, to make up for delays by means of anticipatory regulation. In the spatial domain, we may incorporate a tool to such an extent that our brains remap, for instance, far space as near space. In chapter 1, we saw how time slows down for people who are in the zone. That is to say, people who are totally immersed and focused. They have significantly reduced delta T depth through shifting their attention to one LOD and thus extending delta T length, accommodating far more detail on one LOD than during a normal distribution of delta T depth and delta T length. So was Tommy the pinball wizard in the zone.
Nästa station. Varberg. Var försiktig när du kliver av. Det kan förekomma stort avstånd mellan tåg och plattform. Please mind the gap between train and platform.
Natasha Schull has studied the behavior of individuals who are addicted to modern sophisticated gambling machines and came to the conclusion that it is not desire to win which motivates addicts, but the experience of being in the zone. Although winning might be part of the initial hook, according to Scholl, it fades soon, whereas the allure in the zone does not. The zone is a dissociated state or trance in which players lose a sense of time, space and physical embodiment, consumed totally by the spinning numbers, symbols or electronic card hands before their eyes. Players describe the zone as a compelling, mesmerizing condition of intense concentration, an almost out-of-body experience. Heavy machine gamblers come to crave this state. Admittedly, there is a difference between a pinball machine and a piece of modern gambling equipment. But for most players, focusing and concentration, that is to say, a reduction of delta T depth, are required in handling of both of them. We can assume that, though, that Tommy was no longer in the zone, or as we has also learned it, in a state of flow. He had surpassed that stage and actually formed a new systemic whole by recalibrating his body map so as to simulate the dynamics of the pinball machine. The conditioning effect of playing the machine is that anticipation and the incorporation of the light times recalibrate the system boundaries. The player becomes a temporally extended observer participant. An even more intriguing kind of temporal distortion occurs when the lot of a self-similar nesting cascade can be translated into each other effortlessly. In an idealist mathematical model, delta t depth would at that point approach infinity, and delta t length would approach 0. Such translation is only possible when the temporal structure on the nested lods are self-similar. That is to say, if they only vary in scale. We have briefly looked at an example of such a temporal self-similar fractal in chapters 2 and 3, where we describe the phenomena of overtones and the missing fundamental. As the overtones are integral multiples of the fundamental frequency, they are easily translatable into each other. In fact, they are scale invariant. This scaling generates a superposition of harmonies embedding frequencies of different lengths. In this chapter, we shall look at the phenomena of insight, the instantaneous realization of a highly complex idea, as a manifestation of time condensation, which occurs when delta t depth approaches the infinite and delta t length approaches 0. This phenomenon is a state of zero temporal resistance in the dimension of delta t length, and therefore the experience of instantaneousness, that is to say, sheer simultaneity, while being in the zone or flow, occurs as a result of reducing delta t depth and expanding delta t length. Insight and condensations are triggered by the opposite mechanism. To start with, however, let us look at some of the phenomena which might make time slow down, which we have already encountered. I have suggested that the common denominator in these temporal distortions is the denesting, that is to say, the reduction of delta t depth. First of all, there are stressful situations when we decontextualize in order to be able to focus on detail. As we have seen in chapter 1, accounts of narrow visual and auditory perception are often accompanied by subjective time dilation. When we shut out visual and auditory stimuli, we diminish the number of simultaneous perceptions and thus reduce delta t depth. And here we have a sort of a table on page 209, table 10.1. The distribution of delta t depth and delta t length invokes either flow or insight. Focusing in stressful situations that will induce reducing of delta t depth and increasing of delta t length. Flow, that is being in the zone, will also reduce delta t depth and increase delta t length. Whereas insight could also be called condensation, that increase delta t depth but is reducing delta t length. Another example to be listed in this context is the denesting by means of removing delays. In chapter 4 we saw how the order of events is distorted for us if a delay we have grown accustomed to is suddenly removed. Delay times are temporal observer-participant extensions which widen the protension part of our know, that is to say, the part which anticipates the future. This means that if a delay is shortened or removed, less nesting and thus less simultaneity, delta T depth, exists within the now. Another important way of denesting is by means of synchronization. Entrainment is a reduction of delta T depth, as all oscillations are simultaneous. Nested events, by contrast, overlap and cannot be reduced to one LOD, unless they are self-similar, as we shall see later in this chapter. As we saw in chapter 6, the synchronization of gamma waves in the brain has been correlated with transcendental meditative states. The frequency of silence sought by meditating monks when they focus, for instance, on a mantra in order to be rid of all other thought. During such synchronization, stimuli are denested, which means that there is a reduction of delta T depth. The same mechanism is at work when our body locks into external rhythms, that is to say, during entrainment between inside and outside. Next, we saw in chapter 7 how diminishing contrast correlates with the act of denesting and the perception of time slowing down. The amount of contrast we perceive determines the speed which embedded by objects seems to have. A higher contrast generates more context, so embedded objects appear to speed up. Conversely, a lower contrast creates less context and slows down embedded objects. And finally, also in chapter 7, denesting was shown to be triggered by a reduction in complexity. This can be achieved by grouping percepts into gestalts, thus reducing delta T depth. To sum up, denesting is attained by means of 1. Inducing stress, 2. Shortening or removing a delay, 3. Synchronization, that is entrainment, 5. Diminishing contrast, 6. Reducing complexity. Within parentheses, however, this is also the trademark of insight and condensation, something we'll get back to later. By contrast, nesting is attained through 1. Learning and training, that is spatiotemporal contextualization, 2. Increasing internal complexity, i.e. the range of possible responses. Having called back to mind a number of conditions which accompany a reduction in delta T depth, let us now look at a situation where a sudden collapse of used LODs in the dimension of delta T depth leads to insight via condensation. The term insight has many meanings, and there are disciplines. Let us refer to it here as instantaneous realization of a complex issue by means of complexity reduction. The notion of insight is related to the Greek concept of noesis, which suggests an immediate and embodied understanding. Insight has often been loosely paraphrased as epiphany or the eureka moment. That is a sudden recognition of cause and effect, or an intuitive solution which seems to have come unexpectedly, as if from nowhere. However, insight does not fall from the sky, but is always the result of training and incorporated knowledge. Knowledge which may pop up in a flash, in condensed form and uninvited. I have found Roger Penrose's notion of insight very attractive, because it describes a non-algorithmic instantaneous event. Being non-algorithmic, it cannot have any extension of delta t length, but only in delta t depth. Penrose illustrates the idea of non-temporal experience of insight. With Mozart's ability to perceive highly condensed structures. Aside from Penrose, an extreme example is Mozart's ability to seize at a glance an entire musical composition, though it may be long. One must assume from Mozart's description that this glance contains the essentials of the entire composition, yet that the actual external time span in ordinary physical terms of this conscious act of perception could be in no way comparable with the time that the composition would take to perform. Another composer cited by Penrose is Johann Sebastian Bach, who must have organized his composed work in such a way that it is to a certain extent self-similar. The character of an entire composition can be anticipated in the shortest section. However, in order to appreciate and anticipate the wholeness and complexity of the composition, the listener's fractal temporal interface must be sufficiently differentiated. That is to say, he must have acquired an adequate number of mods, which manifest themselves as possible responses. Another site from Penrose. Listen to the quadruple fugue in the final part of G.S. Bach Art of Fugue. No one with a feeling for Bach music can help but being moved as the composition stops after 10 minutes of performance, just after the third theme enters. The composition as a whole still seemed somehow to be there, but now it has faded from us in an instant. Bach died before he was able to complete his work, and his musical score simply stops at that point, with no written indication as to how he intended to continue. Yet it starts with such an assurance, a total mastery, that one cannot imagine that Bach did not hold the essentials of the entire composition in his head at the time. This is extraordinarily interesting. Penrose is a marvel when it comes to give example as is understandable. Penrose knew what he was talking about. He describes a flash-like insight he had while crossing a street, being preoccupied with a different matter. Suddenly, the solution to a problem concerning the point of no return during the collapse of black holes occurred to him in a flash. Penrose stresses the non-temporal, non-algorithmic character of this insight. No calculation, no thinking, which would have taken time anyway, happened when it struck. In other words, there was no delta t length. For Penrose, the underlying motivation for these considerations was his aim to form a bridge between the quantum world and the classical one, including relativity. In his theory of correct quantum gravity, non-algorithmic elements on the quantum level are catapulted onto the macroscopic level of consciousness. It is somewhere along the lines of this event that, according to Penrose, the arrow of time slips in. The R part of quantum theory, which correspond to the wave function collapse, contains those non-algorithmic catapulted elements in the wake of which the arrow of time appears in the microscopic world. He is aiming for a physics of the mind, in which human consciousness acts as the pivotal point between the physical world of algorithms and Plato's realm of mathematical timeless ideas. Contact with that world can only occur as insight, and non-temporal access to a timeless world. By contrast, our conscious connection to the physical world is algorithmic. It takes time to compute. In the language of my theory of fractal time, Susie Vrobel writes, insight corresponds to condensations. At delta t length approaches zero, whereas delta t depth approaches the infinite and then collapses. Having discussed Penrose's notion of human insight, let us now consider a different mathematical model of this concept, exemplified by the condensation condensations delta t length approaches zeros, where delta t depth approaches the infinite and then collapses. Having discussed Penrose's notion of human insight, let us now consider a different mathematical model of this concept, exemplified by the condensation velocity of two ideal fractal structures. Elsewhere, I have defined condensation as a property generated by temporally congruent nestings within one observer perspective. It is measured in the quantities of condensation velocity and condensation and acceleration, where V and A are derived from delta t depth and delta t length. The quotient at delta t length of log 1 and delta t length of log 2 equals the condensation velocity for V. Log 2, log 1 denotes nested in. For scale invariant structures, that is to say self-similar fractals, Vc is identical with the scaling factor as at t
Var
depth.
försiktig när du kliver av.
These notions are exemplified below by a mathematical fractal, the Koch curve, which we have already encountered in chapter 2. Here we can see the Koch curve. It's visible there, you see it. For all scale invariant mathematical fractals, the condensation velocity is identical to the scaling factor. The condensation acceleration AC equals 1 in mathematical structures, as the scaling factor is constant. So for the Koch curve, the condensation velocity Vc equals 3 and the condensation acceleration Va equals 1. The Cantor dust is another fractal which displays a condensation velocity of 3, and as it also scales as regular intervals, the condensation acceleration is also 1. It is of no importance whether the fractal dimension lies between 0 and 1, as in the generation of the Cantor dust, between 1 and 2, as for the long line of the Koch curve, between 2 or 3, as for the Menger sponge, or is in any other dimensionality. The scaling factor itself determines the condensation scenario. For natural fractals, which display an upper and a lower limit to their scale invariance, the condensation velocity and the acceleration need to be determined individually for each nesting and embedding lod. If long and short time intervals on nested lods exhibit the same pattern of change, for instance, the same variability of fluctuations on all levels, we may define this shared pattern, be it statistical or not, as a constant which serves as a reference scale in order to relate the intervals on nested lods. If we are dealing with non-statistical data, that is to say, if we can define nested lods by unit intervals, a smallest possible interval can be determined. In earlier work, I defined an interval which is indivisible, in the sense that it cannot host further nestings, as the prime. The prime is a natural constraint. We just show the counter dust. The prime is a temporal natural constraint, TNC, since it acts as a limitation on temporal structurability. It is the smallest interval within a nesting cascade and indivisible in Bergsonian sense. No prime can be defined for statistical scale invariance. No limit is defined for the uppermost lod. That is to say, the most extended interval which embeds all others. This is so because our fractal temporal perspective is a phenomenological model which describes the observer participant's nested nodes. As long as he is capable of nesting existing nodes into more current ones, there is no upper limit for the nesting cascade. In his theory of scale relativity, Notala has defined not only a smallest length of scale, but also a largest one. He equates the smallest indivisible interval with the Planck scale, and the uppermost lod with the cosmic length scale, which is related to the cosmological constant. In my theory, the uppermost length scale is our now, our only interface with the world. Quite agree there, actually. TNCs on possible embeddings can be generated both by external physical structures and the observer participant's internal temporal differentiation. That is to say, his degree of complexity measured in the number of possible alternative responses, delta T depth. As we saw in chapter 3, some of the limitations to our experience of the two temporal dimensions, delta T depth and delta T length, result from constraints imposed by our perceptual apparatus. But rather than seeing TNCs as limiting nuisance, it makes sense to consider them as a selection effect. By setting a limited reference scale, they reduce the level of complexity as arbitrariness is eliminated. Without such constraints, no boundaries would be definable within which lods and units may be arranged. Our primary experiences of time, simultaneity, succession, duration, and the now also act as TNCs on our temporal fractal perspectives. And thus, TNCs can be seen as facilitators. They render possible communication, travel, trade, and science. Reduction in complexity is usually a telltale sign of decrease in delta T depth. However, for scale invariant structures, the opposite happens. First, there is an increase in delta T depth, and then a collapse of all lods onto one level. Synchronization, that is to say entrainment, can occur after a scale transformation of spacetimes on all lods. The common denominator which translates between the scales is the structure of the prime, which recurs on all lods. In addition, gestalts and metaphors may also act as DNCs, as we generate and perceive them as indivisible wholes. We form such entities pre-attentively into indivisible wholes which are not accessible to introspective analysis. So we are not aware of many a cause of complexity reduction we take advantage of. This is also true of condensation. In order to properly describe a condensation scenario, it is necessary to introduce yet another quantity, the prime structure constant, PSC. If the structure of a prime, that is to say the scaling structure which recurs on all nested lods, is set as a constant,
Nästa station. Kungsbacka. Kungsbacka.
a kind of scale relativity emerges.
Det kan förekomma
Space-time
stort
is
avstånd mellan
bent
tåg
with
och
respect to
plattform.
PSC.
Please mind the gap between train and platform.
This can only happen if there is structural congruence after scale transformation on all or a number of lods. If this congruence is achieved by a sentient being, for instance, a human observer participant, who registers only the PSC, thus disregarding the length of the individual nested scaling structures, condensation sets in. Condensation is simultaneity within the fractal temporal perspective. It is instantaneous, as it creates no friction in delta t length. A helpful image is a kind of vertical superposition, in which the entire nesting cascades behaves like one lot, vaguely reminiscent of a Bose-Einstein condensate. On the phenomenological level, condensation manifests itself in the experience of insight. And this way it can look like this. Long ago, when I read about Penrose's idea of non-algorithmic access to Plato's world of ideas, I was inspired to develop a theory of fractal time which endeavors to connect our temporal world with the non-temporal realm of times. A complete illustration of the mechanism at work during a condensation scenario is shown in figure 10.4. So this looks. Condensation requires preparation. This is really important. The individual lods which are to collapse into one must first come into existence. This happens via perceptual and cognitive experience and is a learning process which takes time. Intuition does not appear from out of the blue, but is the result of thorough training and embodied memory. At this stage, we create both delta t length and delta t depth. With every new learning step, that is to say, with every contextualization, we embed more lods into the nesting cascade. At the same time, delta t length contracts further and further, while delta t depth increases. At the limit, delta t length approaches zero and delta t depth approaches the infinite. This is the point of direct contact between the world of duration and the non-temporal realm of primes. Figure 10.4 shows this relation in the shape of Plato's triangle. in which I replaced the original term amnesis with recollection. It is simply the nested retentions and pretensions within the now, that is to say, our memory of the past and the future, which are represented on the right side of the triangle. The fractal notion does not imply aspects such as the cleansing of the soul from the excrustation of bodily cares and interest, as does the text amnesis. In the fractal model, nature's participation in ideas manifests itself exclusively in structural congruence via the PSC, which displays characteristics of both the realm of the worldly things and that of ideas. Whereas in the realm of worldly things, the structure of the primes extends in both delta T length and delta T depth. In the world of ideas, it corresponds to the last nesting, obviously, which is no longer divisible and thus timeless. At this point, the structure of the prime has lost its nesting potential. That is to say, it can generate no further delta T depth, and has become timeless in both temporal dimensions. The smallest interval of the nesting cascade thus operates as a T&C, which forms the boundary between time and timelessness by condensing into a state of indivisibility. The observer participant needs to have built up a fractal temporal perspective with sufficient delta T depth to initiate or partake in a condensation scenario. Condensation itself, the eureka movement or insight, is sheer simultaneity. The cognitive work which follows in the reflection of this experience again generates delta T length. I had determined 4 conditions required for the condensation to take place. 1. A nesting of temporal intervals must be recognized and generated. 2. This nesting must exhibit scale invariance, preferably in the form of the PSC, recurring on all lots available. 3. Scale invariance must be other than statistical. Statistical scale invariance does not suffice, since a statistical determination always rests on a large amount of data, and therefore implies divisible extensions. It is not possible to define a prime for statistical scale invariance. 4. The observer participant temporal perspective, that is to say, his now, must be an extended present in Husserl's sense, which compromises the basic structure of the prime of the fractal in question. Sheer simultaneity is not only experienced in insights which rests on training and knowledge. Embodied insight is often sought in states of trance, by building up nesting cascades of synchronous movement of all parts of the body, and then collapsing it into one single rod. Such physical synchronization is often accompanied by the cognitive effort in the form of focusing. For instance, on a spiritual theme. The famous whirling dervishes of Konya perform the religious dance and prayer ceremony, the Sema, in which they reach a state of ecstasy by spinning on their right foot. At the same time, they stretch out the right palm toward heaven and the left toward the ground. Rotating on their own centers, they create a synchronous movement in which their outer parts spin faster than their inner ones. The arms faster than the hips faster than the coccyx. The closer to the vertical spinning axis the body parts are located, the slower the rotation, until at the limit in the center, the spinning occurs infinitely slowly. One may speculate in the same vein whether Tibetan prayer wheels are outsourced focusing of diminished observed participants or incorporated tools of extended ones. In his 4 quartets, T.S. Eliot beautifully captured this idea of an infinite amount of time in delta t depth but not in delta t length. And here comes a side from T.S. Eliot. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, at the still point there the dance is, but neither a rest nor movement, and do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered, neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline, except for the point the still points. There would be no dance, there is only the dance. I can only say, there we have been, but I cannot say where, and I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. I think good time to end there. Say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant evening. Bye bye for now.